So tonight's reading is about migration and the idea of a search for a better life. And so if we look at some characteristics of migrants, we're talking about people, most migrants relocate a short distance. And most people, when we're talking about migration, we're talking about moving within the same country. So keep in mind, a lot of the focus of this chapter isn't just on international, but it's on that internal migration, or so that inter and intra-regional. And then for many long distant migrants to other countries, most people move towards major centers of economic activity. So most people in the search for a better life are coming, somewhere where they can work. And as we know, you have both transnational or international and internal migration going on within all countries. And so if you look at Mexico, you have some international immigration, so people moving in from Central America, from Guatemala and Honduras. So you have people moving into Mexico internationally. Then you have people moving from Mexico to the United States, and some of them are the migrants, the immigrants from Central America. And then within Mexico, you have some interregional, so moving from like a more rural central Mexico area to some of the larger cities, particularly cities that are closer to the US border where there's lots of factories called maquiladoros. And then within central, more rural Mexico, you also have that intra-regional, so people are relocating to new areas within that area. Approximately 9% of the world's people are international migrants. So that means about 680 million people are international migrants. And global patterns today reflect migration tendencies where people are moving from what we usually refer to as developing countries to developed countries. So people are moving from stage 2 and 3 countries into stage 4 countries. So regions of the world that have a large net out migration, right, or emigration. So the net migration is larger for emigration will be Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So these areas have people leaving more than coming in. And areas with a large net in migration would be North America, Europe, and Oceania. So if you look at this map, the thicker the arrows, right, this direction flow map, it shows you where people are moving to. And so you have a lot of people moving to the US from Asia. And then we have a lot of people moving to the US from Central and South America. And then a decent amount still from Europe. And then you get some people moving from Latin America to Europe, lots of people from India into Europe, and then people from Africa. You're going to get more people from Southeast Asia moving to Australia because of, think about that gravity model, it's closer. But you get people from Latin America moving to both Australia, so Oceania, and also moving into different places within Asia. The US has more foreign born residents than any other country. So we have approximately 43 million as of 2010, and that grows by about 1 million people annually. And there are three main eras of immigration in the US. So the first one was the colonial settlement in the 17th and 18th centuries. So when Europeans first came to the United States, that was our first main era of immigration. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, so the late 18 and early 1900s, we had our second big wave of immigration, and that was mostly people coming over from Europe, although different areas. So this was mostly England and Ireland, Spain in some areas, but mostly from England. And then this section here is going to be people from Germany, Italy, Poland, so a different wave. And then the most current wave is a group of people moving over from Asia and Latin America. Here you can see a graph of the different immigration waves, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And here's a map of the US showing you where people, where in the country most people are immigrating into. And so you can see that Texas, Florida, New York, California, they all have really, really high rates of immigration, as do places like Illinois, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio. So all these places have high rates of immigration. And then there's places in our country where you get less than 4,000 people immigrating into your state a year. And so if you look at places, like the North and South Dakota or Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, you have less than 4,000 people moving into your country every year. Same thing like in this middle part here, right? Like Missouri and Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, but less than 10,000 people are immigrating into their state a year from other places. So I do think that's kind of important to consider when you hear people talk about immigration, that a lot of anti-immigration sentiment kind of comes from a lot of these regions with far less immigration, and that places that are experiencing the most of it, we have more familiarity. It's not scary. It's not strangers. It's people we know. We're used to it. We grew up with it, and we have more cultural diversity, so it makes sense. So to put it in perspective a little bit, when I hear people talk, I think like, where do they live? Do they really experience the world the way I have? Because I grew up here, now I live here. And so I've always lived in a place with rich cultural diversity and high rates of immigration. So when I grew up in Chicago, there's a pretty famous Chinatown. There's a huge amount of like North African restaurants, Vietnamese restaurants, tons of people who would move there from Latin America. And so we grew up in this really culturally diverse area. And as you know, South Florida in particular is very much the same. So I think that people who fear immigration tend to live in an area where they don't see a lot of it. And so it's easier for them to believe things that aren't necessarily true. Within a country, people are still moving, usually to have a better life. So again, the biggest reason people move is because they want, usually more money, but sometimes more freedom. Historically, in the United States, we had that westward expansion, which you probably learned about when you were younger. Like when they were moving out west it was God, gold, and glory, right? So they kept moving further and further west. I don't know if you've ever played the game. It probably haven't, but the Oregon Trail, I don't know if you know what that is, but that's a game that talks about the movement west. And so here by 1790, shortly after the Revolutionary War, most people live along the coast. By 1840, we'd spread across the Appalachians. Then we've moved into the Midwest area by 1890. By 1900, we're filling in the plains. And then our most recent trend from 1950 to 2010, people start to move south. Now, clearly by 1900, people are clear across the country. But it just shows you that first we moved west, and then historically we moved south. So you can see in 1995, most of the inter-regional movement in the United States was people going from the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West to the South. People always move in multiple directions, so you still had people going up to the Midwest, up to the West, and less to the Northeast because we had less factories there, and it's expensive to live. So a lot of people are moving down south. A lot of factory jobs moved down south because they had less taxes and it was cheaper to live. And so it's kind of followed this similar pattern. There was also a movement out to the Northwest. And in the 1990s, we had places like Intel set up their factories in Oregon. So you had a big tech movement out here as well, plus Silicon Valley. But Oregon kind of became like another hub for places like Intel. And then when you look at today, 2010, a little bit more recently, you can see that it's kind of balanced out and that the interregional migration with the U.S. is a little bit more equal. People are kind of just moving around all over. And so this shift to go south has kind of calmed down a little bit. Interregional migration happens in all countries, right? So we talked about Mexico a little bit. We talked about the U.S. And so now, like within like Russia, we have interregional migration that was encouraged historically east and north. So they would put factories up north, and they would give you incentives and sometimes force you as like a young man to go work out there. And they really want people to move from this heavily populated area up here more. So the more they could get you to move like up here to work or up here where it's less populated, they would encourage that. Canada's migration pattern follows a similar east to west pattern as the U.S. So Canada's interregional migration pattern has mimicked that of the United States. In China, we have people moving from the rural interior to large urban areas along the East Coast. So they're moving from, small farm areas to large cities to work in manufacturing jobs, which is what really immigration would have looked like interregional in the U.S. In the late 1800s. And then in Brazil, they did something where they moved the capital, which used to be Rio de Janeiro, to Brasilia. And Brasilia is in the interior of Brazil. And so they wanted people to move from the coast into the interior of the country because it had a high population density. It was very concentrated along the coast, and there's not many people living in the interior. So they changed their capital city. So here you can see in China, most people are moving out to the coast. Intra-regional migration, so where do we move within the country? And for the US, we're going to focus on moving first from rural areas to urban areas, but within the same region of the country, right? So you might move from like a farm in Illinois to Chicago. You're still in the state of Illinois, you're still within the same region of the country, but you've moved from a rural to an urban area. So in 1800, we had about 5% of our population lived in urban areas. By 1920, it was 50, and by 2010, it was 80%. So most people who are moving from cities to surrounding suburbs now, that trend started in the 1960s, and that was because people wanted like a different quality of life. So it wasn't about money necessarily; it was about having a bigger yard, having a detached house, having a garage, and schools that they thought would be superior. So you can see historically, first we moved from rural areas into the city, and we still have that going on. Then we moved from the city to the suburbs in what we called the Great White Flight in the 1960s. And today you have a lot of movement in and out, but you're seeing a big counter-urbanization movement of people kind of moving back. So you've got people moving back into the city, and then counter-urbanization is when you move from an urban area to a rural area. And so we have a different kind of pattern going on today. But you do have a big movement of people going back into the city, and then counter-urbanization is when you move from a city out to a rural area. And so that's going on today as well. And that's about it.